So to kick off today's event, we are joined by Maria Popova and Patrick Rosal for an exploratory discussion on art, cities, the nature, and nature in search of new visions for urban life, ways of exploring and finding dialogue and conversation around how we exist as a piece of nature in urban cityscapes. Maria Popova is a reader and a writer and writes about what she reads on brainpickings.org, which is included in the Library of Congress permanent web archive of culturally valuable materials. If you aren't already subscribed to Brain Pickings newsletter, please do so. It's a tremendous resource and phenomenal way to stay abreast of thinking that is both edifying and incredibly therapeutic. Maria is also the author of Figuring and The Snail with the Right Heart, and the creator of The Universe in Verse, an annual charitable celebration of science through poetry. Connecting the dots, we also have with us today the poet Patrick Rosal, who is currently the inaugural co-director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers Camden, where he's a professor of English. Patrick has also published 5 volumes of poetry and edits Some Call It Ballin', a literary sports magazine. We're so thrilled to have both Maria and Patrick with us today, joining us for this Zoom program and being together in virtual space. I'd like to pass it over to John Tracy at Science Sandbox to say a quick hello on behalf of our partners at the Sandbox. Hey, John.
Hi everyone. I really don't want to stand too long in the way of our amazing guests because they are truly amazing. I'm John Tracy. I'm from Science Sandbox. We're an initiative of the Simons Foundation focused on engaging everyone with the process of science. And we've supported a track called Creative Sciences at Newing for the last 2 years and going on our 3rd this fall. So super excited to be here. And in fact, I feel very lucky to be here. This is, I think, my 2nd event this week that I felt this sort of excited urgency. The first was at Biodesign Challenge yesterday, run by Newing alum Dan Grushkin, actually. And I guess what I mean by that, by excited urgency, is the future of science and the future of technology and the future of our climate and our ecosystems has to belong to everyone. It has to be democratic. You know, the stakes are too high. And artists, designers, writers, critics are the delivery mechanisms for that ownership. And I feel confident that that's what's happening here at Newing and has been happening here. So I just want to say that I'm so thankful to Karen and Kelsa and the rest of the team at Newing for making this happen. And with that said, I'll hand things over now to, and this is putting it lightly, one of our most elegant communicators of culture and all of the beautiful sort of messiness that encompasses, the one and only Maria Popova.
That was incredibly generous. Thank you, John. You know, I've been thinking lately about this question of how we bring our biophilia, our native resonance with and affinity for the natural world to the city and to the context of our urban lives. And yesterday morning, I had this flash memory of being very little. I grew up in Bulgaria during communism, during the dictatorship. In my early childhood, I would often be sort of shipped off to the seaside to where my grandparents were for the summer in a city called Varna, which is kind of the cultural capital of Bulgaria. And even during communism, it had a little bit of a kind of trickling in of outside culture. It had music and the European Jazz Festival and Balkan Music Festival, opera, theater. But all those things for a small child were kind of abstract ways of understanding that there was an outside world and there were other lives and other cities and other habitats. What made it concrete for me was actually nature, and a particular fragment of nature. Varna, the city, has this beautiful public park called the Sea Gardens, which is kind of like picture Central Park perched on the cliffside of the Black Sea. And at one of the side entrances to this park, there were 4 trees that absolutely enraptured me because I'd never seen anything like them before. They had these beautiful kind of triangular curved fan leaves that turned bright yellow by summer's end. And of course, those were ginkgo trees, which are so not native to Bulgaria. They're native to Southeast Asia, and actually, Patrick, where your roots are from. And I remember asking my grandparents, how did these trees, why are they here? And that was really what made me understand in a very embodied, creaturely way that, oh, there are other worlds and other cultures out there where people have different nature that lines their streets and lines the hallways of people's imagination, which is what nature really does for us and cities do for us. And you know, as human beings, like trees, we form partly by what's encoded in our seeds and our genetic cultural inheritance that we don't choose, that we're born into, but partly by where we grow and the conditions and the atmosphere and the level of light and nurture that we get. So I've been thinking about that while living right now. I'm here in my apartment in Brooklyn, and down the street, I came here as a teenager alone from Bulgaria, and down the street there is a ginkgo tree as well, which is also not native to Brooklyn. And I just, Patrick, part of why I asked you to have this conversation together is that I've really fallen in love with your poetry, and particularly with this lovely book, Brooklyn Antediluvian, which everybody should get and just cherish, because you touch on these questions in such a beautiful and delicate way of how place and personhood converge within the boundaries of the city, but there's also this real attentiveness to the natural world, the dialogue between nature and human nature. And so I just wanted to see how you navigate that boundary, both as a person also from another root system here, but also as a poet, meaning a person whose job it is to walk the world and wrest meaning from it.
Wow. Well, first of all, I wanted to say thanks for inviting me to have this conversation with you, and to newing folks. This whole idea of the biophilic has been kind of in my head since you made the introduction. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that image that you just gave us to give us an idea of like Central Park on a cliff by the Black Sea it's super evocative to me, and it's close to my own poetics in addressing exactly what you're talking about. And it's kind of this it's the confluence of place, especially if you've had to move around a lot, if that migration has been forced in one way or another. There's a way that I think about my parents coming to the United States, my mom in 1958 and my dad in 1962, which is significant because the anti-Asian immigration legislation was not altered until 1965. So they slipped in prior to the federal laws being changed. And as an adult, I'm starting to understand the breadth and the complexity of what my parents carried with them when they came to the United States. And part of that is the memory of the land itself. And they were conveying it to me and my brothers as we were growing up in really kind of subtle ways. My mom through her garden and her cooking and her care for other people. And my father's a self-taught musician, and there's a way that the land is carried through sound. And you and I in our previous exchanges that has come up a little bit. And me as a musician, I think a lot about the ways that this seemingly ephemeral phenomenon of sound we carry inside of our bodies, no matter the borders that we eventually cross. So certainly all of those things are intersections in my own thinking and in my own work.
There's a really wonderful musicality to your poems, but also a particular kind of music that seems to be in resonance with the natural world. There's a wonderful line in one of the poems about you migrating, already as a migrant, migrating from Brooklyn to Philly. Philly is actually where I landed in America when I first got here, and I spent my first 6.5, 7 years living there. But there's a line saying something like, from Brooklyn to Philly, from bamboo to brass. And it's just this kind of vivid image of the human made and the nature made, and how music carries in the way that almost like weather systems carry. It strikes me what you said about your parents sort of slipping under the radar of these laws. A couple of years ago, I saw an artist had done this project about basically refugee seeds that accidentally traveled around the world in the hull of ships, the soil that's used to kind of weigh down ships. All these seeds kind of migrate around the world that are not regulated, that are often, we're not allowed legally to import produce or seeds or things like this in general across borders. And yet there are all these kind of invisible migrants traversing the globe. And I mean, who knows how those ginkgos ended up in Bulgaria? They do seem a little more deliberate than an accidental planting. But even like thinking about the city, and I mean, trees really obviously for anyone are such a metaphor for so much of our humanity. And in New York, almost everyone I know has a particular relationship to a particular tree, which is interesting because there are an estimated somewhere between 5 and 6 million trees in New York City. So that's basically a tree per every adult human being living here in New York. And I don't know. I mean, I just think about how we all ended up here, and this notion of the tree as both a migrant. I mean, the ginkgo on my block, a migrant from a very far place, but rooted. And this is where it is, and this is the life it has to live, like us who kind of immigrated here. And then in a way, the biophilic city is that to me.
Is the is um is the well, for me part of the biophilic is part of the migrant routes of these things, some of them being unexpected. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately in terms of that migration is that in that movement from one place to another, one thing that is not encouraged in our particularly capitalist society is our habit of attention throughout our movement. And clearly the way that you're talking about your own story from a child in Bulgaria to here in the United States is that you too have had a kind of relationship to nature, but that relationship gets established and nurtured through a practice and a habit of attention to the things that are around you. And I think that the thing about the pace of our lives right now is that it doesn't encourage that kind of attention. And one of the things that art does, I think, is slow us down enough that we can pay attention to what's right in front of us. And in that attention, we begin to cultivate a love. Biophilic means a love of the living, a love of nature. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, about both movement, but the slowness and the pace of that movement that we can cultivate through the slowness of that attention.
And it's interesting because what John said at the opening about art being sort of democratic and belonging to everyone reminded me of something Flannery O'Connor wrote a long time ago, where she basically says art is not democratic. It's only for those willing to pay attention and to do the work to understand it. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think in a way, poetry is what democratizes art by consecrating attention to saying, look at this, slow down, pay attention to this, pay attention to the feeling tone, and let me create a little bubble of experience for you from which you can then regard the outside world. And you do this so beautifully. And particularly, I mean, this book, I was actually wondering, we had chatted about possibly reading one of the poems that I especially love, the Ode to a Pomegranate, eating a pomegranate in Brooklyn, because I feel like it brings us back into these questions.
Yeah, I actually could read that poem. That book I wrote between about 2010 and the book came out in 2016, but probably the last poem I wrote was I finished around 2000. Oh, actually, the long poem 2015. But during the process of writing the book, I had moved from Brooklyn to Philadelphia, and I was healing from a lot of heartbreak. And so this poem is kind of like, this is the touchstone of me sort of going through a process of healing. Ode to eating a pomegranate in Brooklyn. When I fall in love again, I will have another heart and a second set of eyes, which is one way to watch the woman you love grow old. The story of my heartbreak started like this. Someone gave me a key that opens many doors. I traded it for a key that opens only one. I traded that one for another and that for another until there were no more doors and I had a fistful of keys. At any given moment, only part of the world is gruesome. There are 3 pomegranates in the fridge waiting to be broken open. When I fall in love again, my beloved and I will spit seeds into the street until the birds come to pluck them. When I fall in love, I'll count the tick of little pits in city puddles. I'll forget the dead and count the doors instead.
Oh, I love this poem so much. There are
Thank
so
you.
many layers to it, and also so many subtle allusions to the seeds we plant and the seeds we
Mm.
are, and the breaking open of
Hmm.
hearts and possibilities. I was I was looking at your Instagram the other day, and I saw that you had planted a serviceberry bush by your house. And it just so happened that the day before, someone I love had taken me to a there's the Department of Sanitation in New York has a wonderful project along Newtown Creek, that they've created this essentially secret garden, this park way up in North Brooklyn, and there is a serviceberry there growing, and the ripe, and you just sort of like walk up to it in the middle of, literally it's the sanitation plant where
Oh
all
my
of our
God.
waste goes, and
Yeah.
it's this lush little wonderland of living nature, and these seeds, that most people don't know about this park. So it's like the birds are eating them and then dropping them wherever they go, and I feel like so much of culture too takes place in this way in cities. They are the place where things ripen, and then we don't have full control, often in secret. I mean, they ripen kind of in
Mm.
the quiet places,
Mm.
but then little carriers, transmitters of ideas, pick them up and carry them and
Mm.
seed them, and that's how I feel biology and the ecology of ideas are just so parallel in a way.
I love that. I love that. I'm also really interested in the secret, but there's something about the practice, at least as I've inherited the practice of an artist and a poet, that we're not only are we paying attention, we're often paying attention to places and things that other people are not paying attention to. And so there are these kind of like these secluded places, or places that you might just pass by thinking that there's that the space is inconsequential. One of the things that art teaches us is that no space is inconsequential, and that's certainly one of the things about nature too. I remember during the 1980s and sort of my early thinking about ecological concerns. One of the big things in New Jersey here was about the preservation of wetlands, and
Mm.
like I grew up near swamps, and I had no idea in my early childhood that these are actually really valuable ecological systems. And what we come to understand the wetlands as these spaces of biodiversity, of where various ecologies meet. It's a way for the land actually to cleanse and purify itself, but for perhaps decades, maybe even the majority of the 20th century, we went thinking that swamps were essentially wastelands. And so I think there are things that people who have a relationship to the land and a relationship to looking have to teach us about preserving what's still here on the earth.
And actually, a shout out to our mutual friend Elizabeth Alexander, who is the reason I know of your work, and we are having this conversation because a short time ago, she told me about a project that you were doing involving the wetlands and sort of poetry and poets, and taking tools, very kind of rudimentary tools as an observation way of inviting a different form of paying attention. Tell me a little bit about this, because to me that is the ultimate convergence of nature and creative culture.
Well, the hope was, and the hope still is, that we're going to send poets, trained and untrained, out into various ecologies, and some of them being swamps, and just to look and pay attention and to describe things. And the project that I actually came up with was, I bought a bunch of little 7x microscopes, and I just said online, I said, hey, if anybody wants a microscope, I'm making a Microscope Fellowship. And so a bunch of people, probably, I want to say close to 50 people or so, had responded, and I bought a whole huge box of them. And everybody who gave me their address, I put up a little letter saying they got a Microscope Fellowship. I said, your only job is to look at stuff. Go out and look at stuff. And so kids and adults and people from all over the country ordered these microscopes, and they started sending me back pictures of everything from bees' wings to pieces of wood to things that they would just find in their yard. And it was really one of the most rewarding things, was to, number one, just to give things away, but then for people's for artifacts of people's attention, their own looking, just ordinary people, and to get images back of what people were paying attention to. It was really kind of a remarkable thing. And the other thing, I want to credit my colleague, the emeritus professor John Dighton, who we'd have had many conversations out at the Rutgers Research Station in the Pine Barrens, and he was talking about his own training in observation. And I said, man, he studies fungi. And I said, I'm a poet, you're a biologist, and here we find ourselves at this nexus of our practice, which is observation and attention and imagination. And so that whole sort of microscope project came out of a wish to honor the space where scientists and makers converge.
It's reminding me actually of poetry in a way is the lens, right? It's the microscope that magnifies this detail of life and sort of invites meaning, and it invites a different way of paying attention. But it's reminding me of one of my favorite books of all time, E.B. White's Here is New York, which he wrote in 1949. And in it, he has this wonderful line that goes something like, a poem compresses much in a small space and adds music, thus heightening its meaning. The city is like poetry. And to me, that is absolutely everything you described is that spirit. And I'm very interested in how we bring that to our urban lives as creative people in an environment like New York City or Philadelphia that is very much perceived as this concrete box. But at the same time, there are these details that living details that once you start paying attention, it just seems so lush and so alive. And it's just a matter of directing attention to that and feeding on that.
I love that quote from E.B. White. I think one of the things that I'm doing unconsciously is sort of overemphasizing sight. And he's sort of talking about one of the ways that poetry compresses experience is through music. And so one of the ways that we can pay attention, and one of the ways that we often ignore, especially in the city, you're constantly shutting things out sonically, and it is to cultivate a kind of sonic sonic attention, because a poem ultimately is really made of sound. And of course it can convey things through its images, but ultimately it's made of sound. And what a poem does is amplify feeling through sound. So when we have a constellation of feeling in the city, one thing that a poem can do is amplify that feeling through some combination of sounds. And that combination of sounds for the poet can come through the poet's own attention to how can I make language sound like the thing and sound like the thing in the world, so I think that's one way, is through the multiplicity of our attention, through our five senses, through our sort of our other sort of meta senses of the world. And I think that that's a way for us to kind of develop a relationship with our immediate surroundings and our ecologies.
And I mean, you are also a musician, and clearly music informs so much of how you pay attention. I just wonder, I mean, the city, unfiltered, is this astonishing cacophony. So how do you take out of this extraordinary input? I mean, in a way, to me, a poem is more like, in that context, it's more like sculpture than like painting, in that it's shaped by what you leave out and not by what you fill in. So sonically, I mean, sort of tuning out all except the essential feeling tone you want to create. How has music shaped the way you think and write?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a hard question to answer, but I'm gonna try. I mean,
a question, it was more of a roaming thought, but that's the beauty of conversation, right? We sort of improv together.
do you love to dance?
I do.
You strike me as a person that loves to dance. Dancing is a kind of listening, and there are, I'm trying to think about the kinds of listening that you do when you're dancing and the kinds of listening that you do when you're composing or preparing to compose a poem. And I guess it's true of both of those things. I guess maybe you could tell me about your own experience of dancing, but you can either sort of focus in on a particular sound, or you can kind of listen to the whole impression of the thing that you're listening to. And I think that's true of the city too, is that you can sort of broaden your ears and just hear all the things that are coming, or sometimes you can just really focus in and allow that thing to come in. But ultimately, both in dancing and in music and in poetry, it's being open enough to that sonic palette enough that you let it in, and it touches that thing in you that makes you feel something. So it's not just about like, oh, that sounds cool. It's pre-verbal. You don't quite have a language for it. You hear a sound and you're suddenly seized by it. And so in that way, and I was a dancer and a musician before I was a writer. And so I take that sort of practice of listening as a dancer and as a musician into my poems. I don't know if that's your experience when you're on the dance floor or wherever you're dancing.
I love this. And it also, I mean, it reminds me of, so one of the consequences of growing up in communism on the other side of the Iron Curtain is that a lot of the Western classics of children's books never made it over there. So I ended up discovering them as an adult, including Maurice Sendak. And it was my great joy to read Where the Wild Things Are as an adult. And then I became completely obsessed with him and his whole world. And I devoured everything I could. And I remember this one, maybe it was an essay that he did in some obscure collection of something, but it was called The Shape of Music. And he talks about precisely this idea that fantasy and feeling are pre-verbal. And it's an essay about the secret to great storytelling, essentially. But he talks about the music as this kind of sculptural feeling. And I love that the kind of multi-sensory element of story. And I love that you called it a sonic palette, this kind of synesthetic, sound and taste, which is so much of our experience of aliveness. And dance is kind of the supreme expression of being alive. And in a way, I mean, I think part of what speaks to me so much in your poetry is that there is this absolute vitality that excludes none of the senses and invites this kind of embodied, I mean, yes, aliveness to everything.
Yeah. My sense as I've just been listening to you for this, past half hour or whatever, however long we've been talking, I've been wondering as we go along about all the sounds that you carry with you, across the ocean and here into the United States, and your own care, your own stewardship of literature and poetry, and how probably the literature that moves you likely resonates with some sort of sonic embeddedness of your own migration and your own routes. That some kind of subconscious reverberation happens when we read literature. That what we're doing as we move through the world, open in our senses, hopefully, is that we're collecting impressions, and these impressions are sort of all through our body, and then we read something or we hear a piece of music, and whether we have language for it or not, it kind of connects to this whole catalog of sound and experience that we've been gathering our whole lives. And that's my sense of it.
That's so astute. And it's also making me realize something I've never quite been able to figure out. So when I was growing up, one big point of national pride in Bulgaria was that there was a Bulgarian folk song on the golden record that flew into space on the Voyager spacecraft in 1977. It was one of the handful of pieces that Andrew and Carl Sagan chose for the golden record to sort of represent humanity amongst Bach and African drums. And, there was this Bulgarian song, which Bulgaria is a tiny country. It was very much like and it was the sense of belonging with the species, with the rest of humanity through song. And I've always kind of been puzzled and amused by how I've ended up, without having a real background in either, living so much of my life at this intersection of poetry and science. I mean, I have some background in science, and I have no background in poetry other than my love for it. But I do think it's actually through music and this notion of the cosmic, the human interbelonging through this cosmic lens, bringing us back to our literally species conscience, being this intertwined collective entity that is capable of Bach and capable of the atomic bomb, and all of the divisiveness and all of the unity springing from the same source, the same seed.
My brother, like, probably my younger brother Mark, probably days after you first reached out to me about doing this conversation, he sent me a link. He said, "Hey, do you know Marie Howe?" And I said, "Yeah, Marie was my first workshop teacher." And he
Wait,
said,
she was?
"Yeah, that when I was in grad school, it was like, yeah, me too, Marie." And so he sent me the brain pickings of the poem that you just put up very recently. And Marie is thinking exactly about this. Do our molecules and our particulate, do we remember when we were all one thing? And that feels really foundational to the way that I think about, my relationship to other people and the world and my making. And it actually makes me think about artists like Alice Coltrane, John Coltrane, Don Cherry, and especially John Coltrane, whose music, in one interview he gets asked, he's like, why are you so angry? Your music sounds so angry. And Coltrane said, "I'm angry. I'm not angry. The thing is that I'm maybe it's because I'm trying to do so many things at once that I sound angry, but I'm not angry." And I've been sitting with I listened to Coltrane all through writing Brooklyn Antediluvian. That long poem is in some ways a kind of a tribute to his own poetics. But I've been thinking about Coltrane and what he was after. He was gone too soon, of course, but my sense is that he was after our first sound. I mean, even scientifically, we talk about the beginning of the universe as the Big Bang. We describe the origin of the universe in terms of sound. And I think perhaps our greatest composer, certainly our greatest American composer, in John Coltrane, what he was after was like, how close can I get to where we begin in sound? I mean, that might even be a tautology. To where we begin is actually sound itself, that we begin in this small thing. And at the moment of our genesis, it was sound first. And so I think about that. I think, oh, well, we're going to talk about the lineage of poetry and music. It literally goes back to the beginning for me.
And this is such a perfect loop of bringing everything together, because for folks out there, the poem that Patrick just mentioned is called Singularity by Marie Howe. And it actually, I don't think that's in the posted version of it. So this poem, it's called Singularity after Stephen Hawking. And I run this event called The Universe in Verse that John mentioned in the beginning, or Kelsa mentioned in the beginning. And in 2018, Stephen Hawking had just died. The Universe in Verse is a celebration of science, or a sort of a Trojan horsing of scientific ideas through poetry. I had invited Marie to read. It takes place in, remember, physical spaces with many bodies and, thousands of bodies packed in one. That is real, and it's coming back. But The Universe in Verse takes place at Pioneer Works, which is this 1866 warehouse, packed with 1,000 people. And Marie was one of the readers in 2018. For those of you who don't know her work, Marie Howe is an incredible poet and also a very deliberate poet. So she joked at the time that it takes her 10 years to complete and reveal a poem. And there she was writing this poem in the course of like a few weeks. And the way that it began was that her daughter, at the time, senior in high school, wanted to do physics in college. So, Stephen Hawking had just died. So they're sitting in their apartment on Barrow Street, and her daughter, Inan, says something about sort of the Big Bang and singularity. And Marie, who does not have a science background, but has this formidable, wide-spanning curiosity, basically is like, how do we know it's real? And so when she wrote this gorgeous poem, which is about remembering the origin of everything, tracing back that we all began from this one source. And I mean, look for it. It's called Singularity. It's so worth reading and listening to her. But in the live event, so there are 1,000 people, there are maybe 1,200 people. How many health codes we violated by over capacity that year, I don't know. But watching them hang on to every word, and she gets up on stage and she says, how many people here believe in the Big Bang and in the singularity, that everything we know, every datum we've ever produced, everything we've ever composed came from this tiny, 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 tiny. And I mean, this was a self-selected crowd of people who are interested in science. And often, there are physicists, there's like a Nobel laureate in the room. But even so, with our human minds, it's so hard to comprehend that what we call nature, the totality of everything we know, including our own consciousness, which is how it's our interface between us and the world. All of that began from this silent sonic boom, that because the Big Bang actually had no sound, but we can only conceive of it through sound, because it has to have been so momentous, this symphony of existence that began from nothing.
Yeah, I think about that. I think about that all the time, and the kinds of, like Marie, the kinds of perceived divisions and differences. And certainly that's got to be on a lot of people's minds right now. And I think that one of the ways that poetry has been my teacher is that oftentimes where there is a perceived chasm, there is something joining it. There's some perhaps invisible, maybe minuscule bridge, but it's there. And I imagine that those nearly invisible bridges, we trace them back to this origin of the universe too. It's absolutely perplexing. That's what makes poetry sort of impossible, but we continue to sort of pursue it through this composition of sound.
Hmm. What a perfect note on which to, oh, note. See, my brain just did that automatically. So we're so primed. What a perfect note on which to open up to if anyone has any thoughts or questions or puzzlements. We're gonna look at the chat over here, and I apologize. I'm a total Luddite, have not done these things before. So Patrick's gonna pick something for us to.
Let's see if I can read. I've got to put my glasses on. Well, thanks for all the terrific
Oh, such sweet notes.
comments. Don't see any questions yet.
I want to call out on someone named Shakshi S, who mentions a project called Plants, People, and Places, which sounds absolutely wonderful. I would love to hear a little bit more about that. Would you like to tell us a little bit? Where is, if this wonderful person is still with us? I guess not.
Mm,
Kelsa and John, do you have any questions for us? Anything that you were hoping we would get to that we did not?
Or Shakshi's here. Shakshi, speak to us.
Oh, thank you so much. This is such a dream. I can't tell you how many of your blogs I've read, Maria, and I love them so much. And I've introduced your blogs to all of my friends, and it's just so like humbling for me to be here. So yes, my friend and I were working on this project where we try to talk about local tribal communities and how they interact with forests and their natural spaces, and how we can inculcate their knowledge into our urban lifestyles, just so that we can rediscover our relationship with our green spaces. And we are great advocates of having forests in cities. So this is a tiny project that we are working on. So we're trying to create a forest in our city at the moment. It's a long procedure. So I live in India right now. I'm in this tiny city called Lucknow. So we're trying to just like build a tiny forest here. And also my master's thesis and also now my PhD research is a lot about how communities interact with their spaces. So it's just like, it's very, very humbling for me to be here and listen to you guys.
Well, I first of all, I love that you're doing this, and I wanted to offer something that might be of interest both to you and to everyone, all of us gathered here. That same year that Marie read that poem Singularity at 2018 Universe in Verse, one of the other readers was Robin Wall Kimmerer, who some of you might know. She's a bryologist, which is a biologist who studies mosses. She's also from the Potawatomi native heritage, and she brings a lot of her sort of storytelling to writing about science. I mean, she's like one of the topmost bryologists in the world, and she wrote a book called Gathering Moss that is kind of like the most poetic thing you can imagine about the science of mosses. But Robin was part of a program that I believe she started called Forest Understory, that brings poets and foresters together into forests to sort of as creative prompts for the poets to kind of write about nature and think about nature and bring it back to the urban world, but also for forest scientists to really start thinking about the poetic elements of their work and how it can live in the collective imagination. And so she wrote she read a poem that year from that book, Forest Understory. But it's just making me think of how much it calls to us this longing to engage with the living world in the city, and the notion of the sort of urban forest, and within it, the actual forest, whatever shape it may take.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, you know, there's a way that One of the things that's really moving to me about my family story, I have an extended family here in New Jersey, the New York metropolitan area, and despite war, despite colonialism, despite uh, you know dictatorships, all the discontinuities of our family and our community, that um, ways of interacting and taking care of the land have survived through all of those things. And poetry strikes me in its various forms, in oral traditions, in written forms, and so forth. Poetry strikes me as one of the mechanisms by which we preserve those practices of taking care of the land and interacting with the land. I remember several years ago, I was talking to a science writer in the Philippines, and I can't remember what she had directed me to a website that kind of outlined this, but evidently there is a sort of gross correlation between the loss of languages on the planet and the loss of species. So as we have a decline in the number of languages on the planet, it correlates proportionately to the decline of species. So of course, correlation is not causation, but it's enough for us to think about, well, what are the ways that we're using language in order to record, to remember, to observe, and to discover various species?
Care, because when we can name something, we can care about it. And when it is no longer named, it reminds me of a really wonderful project that Robert McFarlane, who's a fantastic English nature writer, did with his artist friend Jackie Morris, called The Lost Words. And it's this beautiful big painted book where in 2010, the Oxford Children's Dictionary removed, I think it was some like 10,000. I mean, it's a colossal number of words from the dictionary, because it's like they have a finite amount of words, I guess, it can include. They removed thousands of words related to the natural world and replaced them with things like broadband, like things about it.
Wow.
And so Robert and Jackie did this book where they wrote these poetic spells for the excluded words, which included things like dandelion and like numbers of birds, beautiful living creatures and plants. And the whole premise, of course, was that it was an act of resistance, because the moment these concepts leave children's imagination,
Mm-hmm.
they leave culture, they leave the locus of our care and concern.
Yeah.
And you're so right that language carries these types of things. Yeah.
Even as we sort of like name places, like especially street names, like there are sort of names of people who might be in power and or have particular kind of influence, and we name places, whereas traditionally we used to name places based on animals we might find there, or the memory of an interaction with nature in those places. So that practice seems sort of inconsequential, but it has an effect in the way that we remember and interact with particular places. I'm so happy to be living on a street called Elm, by the way.
In Philadelphia, all the main streets are named Walnut, Chestnut. They're
Locust,
all
yep.
these kind of living things. And I actually, just this week, I've been reading a wonderful recent book by Joshua Jelly Shapiro, who actually had a residency at Pioneer Works, where I host the Universe in Verse, which is how I know about it, called Names of New York. And he goes into sort of the cultural history of why the names we have for streets and place names in New York are what they are. And so much of it is, I mean, it's very related to your island poem. This no instance of an island, of sort of erasure, and how do you create a world and a city by naming and choosing. And if I may read one verse from your long poem, I think it's the perfect thing to end on, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
It's from the end. So this is from Patrick's book, Brooklyn Antediluvian. It's the long poem called Instance of an Island. And toward the end, which is what this question from Kerwin reminded me of, it says, one way to erase an island is to invent the waters that surround it. You can name the waters, which will turn all the sounds the island makes into salt. It will teach you to listen to everything you love disappear, or you can invent a song so big it will hold the entire ocean. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This was such a delight. I don't know if Kelsa, Raven, John have anything to say by way of farewell.
I want to say thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Patrick. Have a wonderful evening.